Over the last few months or so, I've been driving myself a little crazy over what should be a simple question. Why are internet cookies called internet cookies? If you're thinking that is an odd thing to be obsessing over, as the answer is very easily Googleable, if you stick with me for a few minutes, I think you'll see what the problem is, because it turns out it's a lot more complicated than you might think. HTTP cookies were invented by Lou Montulli when he was working for Netscape in 1995. And on Lou's blog, when the topic of the name comes up, he writes, "I'd heard the term magic cookie from an operating systems course from college. The term has a somewhat similar meaning to the way web cookies worked, and I liked the term cookies for aesthetic reasons. Cookies was the first thing that I came up with, and the name stuck." And so there's your answer. But is that the answer? Because as Lou said, he was referencing the magic cookies he'd read about in old operating systems. So that's really just pushing the question one level back. Apparently, what we really need to ask is, why on earth are magic cookies called magic cookies? And this question right here, this is what kicked off my latest investigation. Because, wouldn't you know it, apparently no one on the internet seems to know for sure what the answer to this is. And in this vacuum of information, numerous outlandish theories have arisen, with everything from a connection to LSD to the Cookie Monster. So let's go through these theories and see which seem possible and which seem half-baked. But this video won't just be my opinion, because, excitingly, I actually reached out to some icons of computer programming, Ken Thompson, Brian Kernighan, and Doug McIlroy on this subject. And astoundingly, they were all kind enough to reply to my silly inquiry about cookies. And between them, they gave me some really great information on the question. Information that I don't believe has been documented anywhere else on the internet. And dare I say it, I think with all the things I've learned, I might be able to slightly clear up this chocolate-chipped conundrum. Alright, seems like we've got all our ingredients ready. Let's get baking. First, some quick context. The old operating system documentation that first included the term magic cookies is the V7 Manual for Unix, published in 1979. For anyone unsure of what Unix is, it's an operating system first created in 1969 by Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie, whilst they were working at Bell Labs. To put it mildly, Unix had and still has a massive impact on our modern technological world. Linux, macOS, and even Android owe an intellectual debt to Unix. Many of the servers that currently host the internet run on Unix-like operating systems. So, what does the Unix V7 manual say about magic cookies? The term magic cookie comes up in the section documenting the C library when describing functions called fseek and ftell. It's not too relevant today to get into the weeds on what these functions do, but basically, the two functions work together to let a program remember a particular place in a file and return to it later. And the manual basically says that in Unix, ftell will return a number measured in bytes. But if the routine is run on some other system, ftell might instead return a quote-unquote magic cookie. And as I understand it, what that's basically saying is that instead of giving the program a number it can interpret directly, it instead gives a sort of code. The program isn't supposed to interpret that code, it's just supposed to keep hold of it and later hand it back to fseek, which knows what the code means. The way I've seen it described is that if you give your code to a code check person, they may give you a ticket that says, say, 366 on it. But you shouldn't assume that that means your code has been placed in the 366th room in the building, or 366 feet away from you. The number itself is not supposed to mean anything to you, but it means something to the code check person. And so when you give them the ticket back, they can easily go retrieve your code for you. So basically, there's no point in you trying to decipher the meaning of 366. Just hold on to the ticket, or magic cookie, as it were, and then hand it back to the person that does understand what the number means, and you'll get the correct code back. Alright, cool, so here's the issue. It's still not obvious why you would name that a magic cookie. And this is the question people have been asking for a while. Why were magic cookies called magic cookies? If you navigate over to the talk section of the Wikipedia page for magic cookies, under origin of name, you can see this discussion play out. As this user says, why is it called a cookie? Damn, you're right, if you try and find out why a cookie is called a cookie, they tell you it's from magic cookies. But where'd they get the name from? On this same page, the last update is by computer scientist Douglas W. Jones, who says, "Once upon a time, I asked Dennis Ritchie about the origin of the term magic cookie, as used in the manual page for ftell and fseek in the C library. He said that so far as he knew, the usage in that manual page was a new coinage, That manual page is not present in v5 Unix, but is present in the manuals for v7 Unix and 4.2 BSD. So now, we return to the question at hand. Where did the writers of this manual pull the term magic cookie to mean an opaque token from? As mentioned, the internet has a lot of theories. Let's go through them. You can pretty much see all the theories here on this talk section of the Wikipedia page. First, we see one user suggests that, quote, magic cookie comes from Dan O'Neill's cartoon strip, Odd Bodkins, which ran in the San Francisco Chronicle from 63 to 70. It was a euphemistic term for LSD. And yes, we can prove that Dan O'Neill's cartoon strip did use the term magic cookies in the mid-60s, seemingly to mean LSD. Although how that is related to our magic cookies isn't clear. Let's put that up as theory number 1 and see if we can prove or dismiss it later. Then you have the idea that it's from a video game. As we see here, a user named Ben Buckner wrote on a 1997 webpage, quote, I've heard the term magic cookie was originally coined in reference to one of those old adventure games, perhaps Adventure itself, in which you had to give some character a magic cookie to get something from it, analogous to cookie verification, but that's just a vague memory. Okay, let's have that as theory number 2. Then you see one user here ask, I'm not a native English speaker, is magic cookie perhaps just another name for fortune cookie? Which is given the reply, not in general, no. It's also notable that fortune has a distinct meaning in hacker jargon, which definitely does derive from fortune cookies, and there's nothing particularly magical about fortune cookies. That said, anything is possible since we don't know. Yeah, as I say, anything is possible, so fortune cookies is theory number 3 then. I found this Reddit reply where a user brings up a connection to something called the cookie virus, or cookie monster virus as it's called elsewhere. That seems like an interesting lead, so let's call that theory number 4. And I think we can probably cap it there. These to me seem like the theories most worth exploring of the ones I've found online. Right, that's our board. Let's go a little deeper on these. First, let's look at the cookie monster virus. What is that? Well, interestingly, it was a very early computer prank. Sort of like a virus, more like malware really. CD Tavares writes about it on the website morticians.org. According to him, quote, the idea for the program was born during a senior house ball session in 1970. Seth Stein, an MIT freshman from Providence, volunteered a story about an IBM computer operator at Brown who liked to tease his users by looking out their terminals and manually sending them messages, asking them for a cookie, until they typed, cookie. Say, I immediately thought, this concept cries out for automation. Tavares built an automated version of this. This program was pretty simple in its function. When someone left their computer unattended, you pranked them by running it. It would work on a timer, and then at a certain point, it would lock them out of their computer and repeatedly demand cookies from them. And you wouldn't get your computer back until you typed cookie. One additional interesting fact about this pseudo-virus is that it wasn't named after the Cookie Monster from Sesame Street. He was only just becoming well known when the virus was taking off. According to Tavares, it was actually named after a bear character in the Andy Williams show, which would demand cookies from Andy Williams. But people saw the name Cookie Monster and assumed the Sesame Street character, and the rest is history. And another interesting thing to note is the version of the program that Tavares originally built ran on the Multics operating system. And Multics was the operating system Bell Labs used and developed before Unix. So I can see there being a chance the guys who created Multics knew about the Cookie Monster virus. So yeah, I don't think we can rule out this theory just yet, as we can see some small connections here. Well, what about the theory it was named after a video game, specifically the game Adventure, or Colossal Cave Adventure as it's also known? Well, that's certainly possible, but with the caveat that it definitely wasn't inspired by Colossal Cave Adventure, as you can check the original source code for that game, and cookie, magic or otherwise, isn't in there. So if not that game, well, which one? Well, I searched and I just couldn't find a pre-1979 game that contained a cookie, especially as an item that you give to someone, as described by that user Ben Buckner. The closest I could find was a game named Chomp, or as it was called elsewhere, Zot, which involved people playing on a grid, and this grid is called a cookie, with the idea that you and the other player take turns eating the cookie, try not to eat the poisoned part. But I don't think that game is relevant here. It just doesn't seem to fit the description of what we're looking for. But yeah, other than that, I couldn't find any other cookie-related games. That doesn't mean one didn't exist, of course. Lots of people, especially the geniuses of Bell Labs, made their own games that didn't become known to the public. Perhaps that's what's being referred to. I also do wonder if perhaps the Cookie Monster virus is being remembered as a game. That's possible, I guess, but that's all I've got on the game theory. So whilst I don't think we can dismiss it straight away, I think it is on shaky ground. And at this point in my investigation, I was stuck. I didn't really know how to check anything further, I spent a hell of a lot of time searching through old academic papers, digitized 70s computer magazines, and newspapers looking for early technical references to cookies, and pretty much came up empty-handed. So I wasn't sure how I could prove or disprove any of the remaining theories. In an act of desperation, I thought, well, maybe I'll just message the guys who invented Unix and see if they can tell me the answer. So I did that. And then I told myself, well, that's a bit of a long shot, and I should prepare myself mentally for the fact that it was unlikely I would receive a reply. And then Ken Thompson replied to me. As mentioned, Ken is one of the two co-creators of Unix, and to save us all time, rather than listing out his huge list of accomplishments, I'll just simply say he is regarded as one of the greatest and most influential computer programmers of all time, and from that, I imagine you get the gist. Ken unfortunately told me that he did not know where the term came from. He said it wasn't his idea, but what he could tell me was cookies, without the magic part, was just part of the lexicon at the time. Which is actually incredibly informative, because that means the guys at Bell Labs were casually using the word cookie in their jargon first, before magic cookies became a thing. The magic part in the manual was just describing a particularly interesting cookie. But the term cookie by itself was already a valid bit of jargon, apparently. And what that tells us, I think, is that we can disregard the theories that specifically mention magic cookies, because the magic part only came after the term cookie was already being used. So really with that, I think we can disregard the Dan O'Neill comics origin. Ken also told me that, quote, I think it came from early video games that allowed one to do something, which is obviously a big tick in the it came from a game theory. So that's incredible. Now we're only left with these theories. Okay, so how do we narrow it down further? Well, I thought to myself, I can't believe Ken Thompson replied to me, so maybe Brian Kernighan might reply to me too? Brian is, again, a legend in computing history. He was an early and influential contributor to Unix, played a key role in the introduction and popularization of the C programming language, is the K in the AWK programming language, and if you've ever taken a beginner's computing course and made the computer say the term "Hello World," you have Brian to thank for popularizing this tradition. So once again, I sent a message, but not really expecting a reply. And then Brian replied. Unfortunately, he too wasn't sure of the origin, but did provide this fascinating bit of info. He wrote to me that, I dimly remember Bob Morris using cookie quite early, say early 1970s in some context, and magic was never part of it that I recall. So there we have the corroboration that cookie, without the magical part, existed first, and apparently was a thing even in the early 70s, and specifically Brian mentions Bob Morris in particular using the term. Robert Morris was one of the programmers at Bell Labs that worked on developing Unix. He made many important early contributions to its creation and had a particular interest and knack for cryptography and password security. Lastly, in his reply to me, Brian mentioned that Douglas McIlroy might have some more insights on the subject. Douglas McIlroy is once again a legendary figure in computer programming history. Amongst many other achievements, he was a major force in the creation of the idea of Unix pipelines, which in simple terms is the way Unix sent information from program to program. This idea is what helped Unix build such powerful tools. On Douglas McIlroy, Ken Thompson once said, he's the smartest of all of us. So, just like the other emails, I sent off my inquiry to Douglas, under no expectation that yet another legend in computer programming history would reply to me. And then Douglas replied to me. And interestingly, Douglas echoed Brian's opinion. He said, my recollection coincides with Brian's. Bob Morris introduced the term to our group. I don't know whether he picked it up elsewhere. In Morris's usage, a cookie was typically a saying or formula, often enigmatic, that appeared in an unexpected context. It may be short for fortune cookie, or metonym for crumb, as in crumbs of knowledge. Which of course is tons of great info. And so even at this point, I was pretty excited by what we had confirmed. We know who to thank for the term, which is Bob Morris, and in which context he would originally use it. Then in a later message Douglas sent me, he said, in regard to my speculation about etymology, I think fortune cookie is more likely progenitor than crumbs. Incidentally, BSys, Bell Labs OS for the IBM 7094, issued fortune cookies on drop printouts circa 1961. The first day that cookies appeared, users pored over each other's output to see them. Which I think is a super cool tidbit of information, and to me strongly puts a tick in the fortune cookie theory. As none of the guys I asked mentioned the Cookie Monster virus, I think that seems the least likely option here. Unless we think, as I briefly mentioned earlier, that there's a possibility the virus was being remembered like a game, because it sort of functioned like a game. And I will say there's a fun story told by David Korn in an interview with networkworld.com that describes a prank that was sort of emulating the Cookie Monster virus. He says, "When I joined Bell Telephone Laboratories in 1976, my supervisor was Mike Pillar, who was one of the first Unix adopters for an internal operations support system. Mike liked to play practical jokes on his people, often as a learning experience. One day, Mike was trying to resolve a Unix problem, so he called Ken Thompson, the co-inventor of Unix. While he was on the phone in front of his terminal, deep in conversation, one of the members of the group, named John, used the write command to write on his terminal, 'panic, no cookie.' Mike then reported to Ken, 'Ken, I just got a panic, no cookie. What does this mean?' After a couple minutes of back and forth between Mike and Ken, John came into his room with a box of cookies and reported what he'd done. So that is a bit like the Cookie Monster virus, so maybe there is a connection there. Or maybe that just points towards what we already know. The cookie was already a sort of in-house Bell Labs meme by this point. Either way, if you had to twist my arm, personally, I'd probably dismiss the Cookie Monster theory. And in that scenario, we'd be left with two remaining theories. Either Bob Morris got the word from video games, or he was referring to fortune cookies. On the video game front, as Ken Thompson specifically had a memory of it, I find it hard to dismiss this as a possibility. But that is at odds with the fact that I simply can't find a pre-1979 game that involved a cookie, except for Chomp, which I mentioned earlier, but that specific game just doesn't seem relevant. One thing I do think might be something is that in Colossal Cave Adventure, the specific game that was mentioned as maybe being the actual culprit, there is an item called Tasty Food that you find early in the game. And then later in the game, you come across a bear, and you can tame it by giving it the tasty food. Now that mechanic does actually fit that user Ben Buckner's description when he wrote, "You had to give some character a magic cookie to get something from it." And actually, we do know that the cookie bear from the Andy Williams show was a thing. He, like the character in the video game, was an animal that demanded food. And specifically, demanded cookies. So maybe I can sort of see how all those things got conflated, and this very popular game where you had to give a bear a tasty treat got remembered as having to give the bear a cookie. Maybe I'm just clutching at cookies here, but maybe that's what happened. Other than the video game, we're left with the fortune cookie theory, which is the theory Douglas McIlroy thought most likely. And it does make sense. A fortune cookie being a little opaque thing that has information inside of it is a pretty good analogy for a technological cookie. In fact, Lou Montulli, in an AMA 3 years ago when he was asked again about the origin of the name cookies, says, "Thanks, I expected this one is based on a fortune cookie, a message wrapped in a container. The name cookies comes from a software trick from an old operating system manual I read a few years earlier, a technique for passing information back and forth between the user and the system. For some reason, the small piece of data exchange had been called a magic cookie." And this is interesting because this is the first time that I could find where Lou mentions fortune cookies. In the earlier times I found Lou explaining the name, he only mentioned the old magic cookies reference and how he liked the aesthetic of the word for his creation. So seemingly what that means is he liked how he saw a connection to the idea of fortune cookies. So wouldn't it be cool if it turned out that magic cookies were actually also inspired by fortune cookies? Unfortunately, Bob Morris passed away in 2011, so I couldn't message him to ask him. But when I was reading about him, I came across a really cool story on Dennis Ritchie's website. One sentence in this story really helps paint a good picture of Bob's views when it came to computer security. He saw it like a puzzle or a game. Dennis writes, "Because Bob privately referred to his crypt commands as a sequence of graded exercises, it's evident that he liked both making ciphers and breaking them." In the article, Dennis talks about how Bob owned a Hagelin cipher machine, usually referred to by its US Army Signal Corps designation M209. And as the story goes on, Dennis Ritchie, along with Robert Morris, and based on the work of Jim Reeds, created a program that would break the ciphers created by the Hagelin M209. I recommend going and reading the story yourself as it's an enjoyable read. But long story short, they reached out to the NSA to see if the paper they wrote on the subject was allowed to be published. A man comes to meet them whom Bob called a retired gentleman from Virginia, who ultimately said, quote, "Perhaps we should exercise discretion. It was certainly legal to publish, but publication might cause difficulties for some people in the agency." As the story ends, the retired man from Virginia essentially offers Dennis and Bob that if they ever wanted to see the true cutting edge of the cryptographic world, they might want to look into a consulting job with the government. Talking about the meeting afterwards, Bob described this approach as he's bringing out the dancing girls, and observed that making such an arrangement implied a serious commitment about the course of one's future work. But in time, Bob did leave Bell Labs for the NSA, becoming chief scientist of the NSA's National Computer Security Center. Robert Morris actually features in the book, The Cuckoo's Egg, the real-life account of Clifford Stoll's attempt at hunting down a hacker. He reaches out to the NSA for help and meets Robert Morris. And there's a fun part of the book that I think gives a good insight into Morris. Stoll writes, "Well, I arrived at NSA, and Bob Morris greeted me in his office. The 3 chalkboards were covered in Russian writing. They're rhyming riddles," he explained, "and a few mathematical equations. Where else but at NSA? I chalked a short note in Chinese, and Bob hit me with an easy problem. OTTFFSS. What's the next letter, Cliff?" That was an oldie. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. "The next letter is E, the 8, I announced. Well, we fooled around with puzzles and palindromes for a while, until he wrote out this series of numbers. 1, 11, 21, 1211, 111,221. Complete that series, Cliff. I looked at it for 5 minutes and gave up. I'm sure it's easy, but to this day, I still haven't solved it. After Robert Morris retired from his position in the NSA, in 1995 he was a guest speaker at a cryptographic conference. He gave a talk on non-cryptographic ways of losing information. The author Stephen Levy gives a description of this talk in his book Crypto. Apparently in the talk, Morris said the 2 most important things to keep in mind when it comes to this security were 1. Never underestimate the time and expense your opponent will take to break your code, and 2. Look for plain text, which is then explained in the book in the following way. Quote, "This was reassurance to the crowd that no matter how baffling the task of code breaking might seem, the fact is that very fallible human beings are the ones who must employ these sophisticated systems. So sometimes when one least expects it, a seemingly impenetrable code, the jumble of ASCII confetti one must hammer into human language, might have a passage or entire message somehow unencoded. In that case, you could read it as easily as a fortune cookie." Now, I don't know if that's the author Stephen Levy paraphrasing what Robert Morris said in his talk, or quoting him directly. But if it's a direct quote of Morris, that would be sort of a smoking gun for us, and I think it would point heavily towards the conclusion that when Morris used the term cookie, metaphorically, he was inspired by fortune cookies. One thing I think I can confidently say is Bob Morris enjoyed codes, puzzles and riddles, setting them and breaking them. And so I do think he would have got a kick out of accidentally setting one more puzzle and sending me down this rabbit hole trying to solve the cryptic case of the coded cookie. So that's as far as I managed to track the term down. Not a complete answer, I know, but I hope I've managed to at least partially clear up why magic cookies were called magic cookies. And if you're frustrated that I didn't manage to give you a more concrete answer, well, I'm afraid sometimes that's just the way the cookie crumbles. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please do like, comment, subscribe, hype, all the things that tell YouTube this video is worth watching and showing to more people. And if you figured out Bob Morris's number riddle, feel free to post that in the comments too. But for now, that's everything I've got for you today. Bye, folks.